Hi, everybody. We chose to do our presentation on drug legalization today, and we put together some slides with some narrated facts to go along with it, so we hope you enjoy.
To begin, we want to talk about the history in regard to drug legality as a means to understand why we have certain views about drugs and whether or not they should be deemed criminal. Drugs have pretty much been around since the birth of the United States. For example, opium was very popular during and after the Civil War. Cocaine was once used in health drinks and medicine, and also, not to mention, in Coca-Cola. Even heroin at one point was used as medicine to treat respiratory illnesses. It was not until about the end of the 19th century when people started to see the potential for addiction on drugs such as these. Actually, as a fun fact, you could buy a syringe with a small amount of cocaine in it for about $1.50 in the 1890s. This realization that these drugs have the potential for addiction sparked the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, which was the United States' first drug policy. Since then, there have been many prohibition laws and taxes created to deter people from drug use. Since then, the government has used multiple types of propaganda in order to get and maintain public support over criminalizing drug use. An example of this being that marijuana was solely to blame for strange cases of insanity, murder, and sexual assaults. Some more examples include the pictures provided on the slide. President Nixon officially declared the infamous war on drugs in June of 1971, saying that drug use was public enemy number one. The war on drugs proposed strict measures, like mandatory prison sentencing for drug crimes, and from this the DEA was established in 1973. However, in more recent years, it has been revealed by former Domestic Policy Chief John Ehrlichman that the supposed war on drugs had very different goals and motives behind it than what seemed to be the case. Ehrlichman is quoted saying, "The war on drugs was a ploy to keep Nixon in office and oppress the anti-war left and black people. The administration knew they would not be able to make being against the war or being black illegal, but by associating these groups with drugs like marijuana and heroin and making them heavily criminalized, they would be able to disturb these people. This has led to not only racial divide, but also racial targeting that is still very present to this day." Before the Nixon presidency, America was already starting to see the shift towards decriminalization. The Johnson administration passed the Narcotics Addict Rehabilitation Act of 1966, which specified that narcotic addiction, also alcoholism, should be viewed as a mental illness. However, drug use was still deemed as criminal activity. After Nixon's presidency, there was growing distrust in the government during this time from situations like Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, and many felt laws against the use of marijuana and other drugs were simply unjust. Even in 1977, President Carter called for decriminalization of weed, saying, "Penalties against possession of the drug should not be more damaging than the drug itself." From about 1973 to 1978, many Americans were pro-decriminalization. By 1978, a third of the country lived in states where possession of marijuana would at most mean a small fine. However, this culture sparks the drug paraphernalia industry. With little to no regulation, they seemingly singled out children. Paraphernalia and even weed could really be bought just about everywhere, like at corner shops, music shops, etc. This easy access sparked an increase in adolescent marijuana use, which created a huge backlash, thus initiating the parents' movement, which sought to close shops selling marijuana and rescind laws decriminalizing weed. By the 1980s, many decriminalization laws were reversed, and the U.S. was ushered into a new era where, despite adolescent drug use being at a lower rate, politicians, especially the Reagan administration, saw drug use as a national emergency. The Reagan presidency brought a refocus on drugs, which led to the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum prison sentences for specific drug offenses, which subsequently resulted in a serious increase in incarcerations for nonviolent drug crimes. And this also led to the infamous Just Say No campaign. Today we are seeing a comeback in marijuana legalization, specifically since about the 1990s, with a more open-minded political view on recreational drug use. For instance, Michigan has recently voted to legalize marijuana. However, there are still millions of people who fervently are against the decriminalization of drugs, but it is easy to see why many people have such a criminal outlook on drug use through our history in the U.S. with drugs. And how many of us today, especially older generations who grew up being told constantly how dangerous drugs are, have this outlook. We are also seeing a rise in teenage and young adult drug use as a possible repercussion of our current drug culture. However, today more than ever, there is a shift towards rehabilitation and prevention through things like PSAs, drug education like DARE, the primary, secondary, and tertiary drug prevention programs we have read about in the book, making it harder to obtain drugs like opioids, and the millions of rehabilitation centers and organizations committed to helping those afflicted with drug abuse. To end this portion of the presentation, here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Prohibition goes beyond the bounds of reason in that it attempts to control a man's appetite by legislation and make crime out of things that are not crimes.
All right, so we slightly mentioned the topic of legalizing drugs, but if we do this, will it benefit our society? So one of the first benefits of drug legalization that many proponents of legalizing drugs argue is that it would protect our basic constitutional rights. So the United States Constitution and anti-slavery laws state that you should pursue your own happiness as long as others' rights to life and property are not infringed upon. So if somebody wants to take drugs, typically they don't become violent. A lot of times they just become sort of in a stupor and sit and mind their own business. So it really shouldn't be anybody's business what they want to do with their own body. So a lot of people think that anti-drug laws are an act of governmental control over individuals, since if you tell people they can't take drugs, then they do not have full control of their own bodies. So then this leads to the very kind of deep question of, are people truly owners of their own bodies then, or are we a property of the government or a slave? So this sounds very harsh at first, calling someone a government slave just because the government prohibits them from using illegal drugs can sound quite radical. But if you can get past the sort of radical nature of this standpoint, think about strip searches, urine tests, roadblocks, full car searches on the side of the road just because police may think that you're on drugs. All these sort of checks to make sure you're not using drugs. If you stop and consider all of that, and everything that government does to try to control our own bodies through drug prohibition, this viewpoint may seem a little bit less radical and a bit more reasonable. Another pro on the side of legalizing drugs is that all drug products would enter the free trade market just like any other good in our market. This would benefit both the seller and the buyer. The seller gains money, which they value more than the drugs, and the buyer gains the drugs, which gives them pleasure, and they value this pleasure more than their money. Therefore, everybody in the interaction ends up being happy. However, there undoubtedly will be third parties that disapprove of this transaction. But do third parties really matter in the scheme of society as a whole? If you think about other transactions within our free market that already exists now, third parties get offended all the time. Many people disapprove of alcohol and cigarettes, which are drugs that are already legalized, but they still exist within our free market. Even commodities like bottled water are disapproved of by many due to their harmful effects on the environment, but they're still included in our free market. So even if people disapprove of the use of drugs, why should they be discluded in our free market if all these other things are included that some people may not like? The next benefit of legalizing drug use that I'm going to discuss would be a large reduction in crime rates. If drugs were legalized, the price of illicit drugs would decrease. With drugs being available as a free trade commodity, like discussed in the previous slide, dealers would no longer be able to raise the prices as high as they like. There would be more stability and control in the market. This price decrease of drugs would eliminate or highly reduce drug-related theft and murder. Due to the extremely high prices of drugs in the current system today, where drugs are legal, people often steal drugs or even murder other people to get the drugs they want. They think this is their only option since they can't afford to purchase the drugs. Another aspect of crime that would decrease would be gang and street violence. Oftentimes, dealers use gang and street violence to solve drug disputes now, which creates a lot of crime. If drugs were legalized, dealers could use the court systems and settle the issue in a civil dispute by suing another dealer, similar to if a business wanted to sue another business. It's just another business. Another large sector of crime that would be decreased would be drug cartels. Drug cartels would become less profitable with the legalization of drugs in America. International drug cartels make an insane amount of money by trafficking drugs into the United States. This drug trafficking can lead to crimes as intense as terrorism by other nations. If drugs were legalized, cartels would not be as necessary to supply drugs to America. Therefore, cartel activity would decrease. Lastly, and the most straightforward aspect of crime reduction would be related to drug crimes of possession, possession of paraphernalia, and distributing. Those crimes would be eliminated completely. Buying and selling drugs would become like any other business transaction, like I mentioned earlier. Nobody would end up in jail. This would free up jail space for dangerous criminals, and it would reduce the amount of tax dollars spent on providing jail services for petty marijuana users, for instance. Next, I'm going to focus on the health benefits of drug legalization. A major health benefit that would result from the legalization of drugs would be the elimination of the potency effect. The potency effect is a phenomenon that occurs in the current legal system where drugs are more potent to create a higher price and more demand. In the current system, it is risky to be a drug dealer. So, dealers try to make the highest profit off of each deal so that they can reduce the amount of deals that they must do. Each time a dealer completes a deal, they are putting themselves at risk of getting caught and put in jail. To minimize their risk of getting caught, they try to reduce the amount of deals they do without reducing their profit. One way to maximize profits is to deal drugs with a high potency level. These potent, risky drugs create a higher profit for the dealer because they can charge more for them than for more tame drugs like marijuana, for example. This, in turn, makes people more likely to become addicted to dangerous, potent drugs than to less dangerous, less potent drugs. The people buying can only buy what the dealer has to sell, and if it's potent drugs, then people will get hooked on potent drugs. Another health benefit that drug legalization would bring is the ability to regulate the quality of drugs on a nationwide basis. A government organization like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, could evaluate all drug products to make sure the ingredients are pure and unlaced. The FDA could take on this role, or maybe an entirely new government organization could form. A regulation system to quality check illicit drugs would save many lives. Oftentimes, drugs are laced with other drugs without the consumer knowing, or drugs are made with synthetic harmful materials, or drugs are extremely potent unbeknownst to the user. Recently, in pop culture news, you may have heard about the opioid fentanyl being laced on other drugs. Fentanyl is extremely potent and is more harmful and addictive than heroin. It is extremely easy to overdose on. Within the past couple of years, rapper Mac Miller, singer Tom Petty, and pop icon Prince all died of mixed overdoses due to drugs being laced with fentanyl. Cocaine was the drug that was laced with fentanyl for all three of these men. While these three men knowingly consumed cocaine, even though they knew it could be harmful to their bodies, they did not knowingly consume the fentanyl. If there was an organization to check for impure drugs like this, these three men, and thousands of other American citizens like them, may still be alive today. Drug legalization would not only benefit the health of individuals in a population, but it would also benefit the community as a whole. Legalizing drugs would eliminate the need for drug dealers on street corners, as drugs would be available in more controlled settings like dispensaries. By not having drug dealers on the streets of inner cities, the young people in these urban areas would not be swayed into that lifestyle. Inner city youth often fall into the drug dealing lifestyle due to witnessing the large amounts of money that can be made in this black market business. To add on to the community benefit, if teens stay out of drug dealing, then they may not grow up to lead lives of crime. Drug dealing is often the first step into a shady lifestyle. Teens who start out committing small offenses, such as a drug deal here and there, are more likely to end up committing more severe crimes involving theft and murder, for example, as they grow up. Youth can get corrupted by drugs, and as much as we might not like to admit it, so can police officers. Not all police officers are morally perfect. They're human too. The current drug climate in America leads to police corruption in many cases. Since drugs are illegal and police officers work to enforce the law, drug dealers do not want any run-ins with police. What better way to ensure that the police will stay away from you than to secretly work with a police officer on your side? People are motivated by money, and unfortunately, some police officers allow money to influence their job. Drug dealers often will pay off police officers to look the other way, to keep other police officers from catching on to their crimes, to help them move drugs, or to deal drugs him or herself, especially to prisoners. If drugs were legal, drug dealers would no longer have any need to try to corrupt police officers, which would make the law enforcement system much more trustworthy. Finally, I sort of previously touched on this topic, but to go into it a little deeper, the last benefit of drug legalization we will discuss is financial. Legalizing drugs would save taxpayers loads of money. Billions of dollars are spent every year in America on drug enforcement efforts. These dollars go towards police programs to try to bust dealers and distributors, and also to public service announcements to deter people from using drugs in the first place. Another way that U.S. taxpayers' money is spent is to fund prisons. Thousands of people are currently in prison for drug-related charges. If drugs were legalized, people could no longer be sent to prison for drug charges. That would free up prison space and maybe even allow us to close some prisons so that taxpayers would no longer have to pay for them anymore. So that concludes the pros for drug legalization. So now let's consider the cons, starting with marijuana.
There are not a lot of cons in the economy when talking about legalizing marijuana. However, there are some cons to legalization, such as health problems that come with smoking marijuana and other drugs. For starters, marijuana gives you a high that other drugs can't. Since it is this way, a lot of people want to try it. When this happens, they get hooked. This causes a number of health problems. Since marijuana is a relaxant, it can restrict blood flow to your head because you breathe slower. It also has a great effect on your lungs. Marijuana is said to affect your lungs more than cigarettes do. I don't know about you, but I don't want my lungs looking black and clogged with all that crap. Marijuana also has a huge impact on your memory and cognitive function, making it harder to do everyday things. It takes a huge toll on you mentally, as you have an increased chance of getting depression and anxiety, which are two big mental disorders. It also attacks your immune system over time and causes it to become very weak. When this happens, your body actually attacks itself, causing it to become weaker and weaker. Finally, marijuana is very addictive. This causes its users to become very dependent over time, and eventually they will use it so much that they can't quit. Marijuana is labeled as an illicit drug. There are many more problems that come with illicit drugs than most people think. Illicit drugs do a number on you mentally. They cause a whole lot of problems. Amnesia, or trouble sleeping, is one of these problems that come with illicit drugs. Dementia, or extreme memory loss, is another one of these problems. Also, anxiety, which is when you worry about everything, can be associated with illicit drugs. Psychosis is also a problem that comes with an illicit drug. This is when you lose a sense of reality because your thoughts and emotions are so impaired because of the things these drugs do to your brain. These drugs cause a lot of car accidents because the driver is so impaired and his brain is so affected, making it harder to judge what is going on the road. Also, these drugs can cause HIV and hepatitis C as they weaken your immune system, making it easier to contract these diseases. These drugs can also lead to a lot of violence, as again, you are impaired when you are taking these drugs, and one thing can set you off, causing a whole lot of problems. Since these drugs are so addictive, they cause a whole lot of overdoses because people taking them will push themselves to the limit. This is when overdoses happen, and even more extreme, a lot of people can die from these overdoses if not treated correctly. Finally, since these drugs are hard on you mentally, people can commit suicide as a result of all the mental disorders that happen because of all these drugs. As I stated in the previous slide, illicit drugs can impair your ability to make decisions. They alter teenagers' abilities to make decisions more than they alter adults. This is because the teenager's brain isn't fully developed yet, so it has a bigger impact on it. They also alter the thinking, memory, and learning part of a teenager's brain. Illicit drugs can also alter your ability to drive, especially marijuana. The THC component of marijuana alters a person's perspective while driving. This component reduces your memory and thinking, making it harder to react to the brakes or remember where you're supposed to be going. Marijuana also serves as a gateway drug to much harder, more dangerous drugs. This is because the high that is associated with marijuana isn't a very high, so users are going out there looking for new ways to get high. Because of this high that marijuana brings, these users are wanting to get higher, so they start using harder drugs that will give them that. This is both dangerous to that person and to the communities. Illicit drugs have a huge impact on pregnant mothers and their fetus. When a pregnant mother takes a drug, they have a huge impact on these fetuses. It increases the chance of the baby getting several birth defects. It can also cause the baby to be born prematurely. When this happens, the babies are underweight and not as healthy as it should be. This causes a lot of problems as the baby can be put in the ICU for a while. These drugs also impact the baby as the baby could be born a stillborn because of how premature they are.
So getting into the supporters of legalization of marijuana, specifically in America, 6 in 10 people say they have recreationally used marijuana and that it should be legalized. 62% of Americans agree on legalization. This is up 1% from 2017, but doubled from the year 2000. Now, taking a look at some of the generations, millennials have support of 74%, Gen Xers at 63%, baby boomers at 54%. The silent generation is currently unknown, and you can see a trend between the younger generations. Typically focusing on the younger groups who have had first-hand experience with marijuana and have not seen the negative downfalls that could potentially come from this. As you can notice, the percentage is trending down towards older generations because they have seen the pitfalls and hold their word, typically focusing on the war of drugs and the cartel violence from Mexico in the late 70s and the early 80s that spilled over into the United States, causing the older generations to decline on the legalization vote for marijuana usage. Now getting into the politics of legalization. Starting off with Democrats. Democrats have 49% support and 28% opposition. This brings them to 72% of total support of all Democrats. The Republicans have 32% support and 50% opposition, which brings the total Republican population to 51% of total support. Recently, there's been an interesting shift into the House, specifically a former House Speaker, John A. Boehner. He stepped down to join the directors of the cannabis company. Boehner was once totally opposed to decriminalization and legalization of marijuana, and now he supports a cannabis company. You're starting to see a shift more towards mutual interest in both sides, as both parties are beginning to see a shift in opioid use and ranging away from marijuana use. House representatives and higher-ups in the Oval Office are now shifting and using support for marijuana as a part of their campaign, which typically targets younger people to earn their vote. Continuing on about the politics of legalization of marijuana. Between the years of 2000 and 2008, support of legalization has doubled, typically mainly due to the research and the findings that marijuana is not a gateway drug. This was recently taken off the DARE, the D-A-R-E list, has had marijuana listed as a gateway drug dating back to the late 80s to 2018. Many voters are swaying from no to yes. Many are in favor of decriminalization to reduce gang activity, violence, and reduce drug dealers, although majority is not in favor of legalization for recreational use. Getting into the decriminalization overview, the states have amended laws to make certain criminal acts no longer. If you're caught with a small set amount by each state growing or holding, you will not be prosecuted. However, any larger quantities than the jurisdiction, you will hold a higher sentence. There's a difference between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization is an amendment to the law, where legalization is no lawful infractions but set amounts by the government. Now getting into some of the facts about legalization in the United States. 10 states, including Washington, D.C., have legalized marijuana for adults over the age of 21. Michigan, being the most recent state to legalize marijuana, serves that you can have 12 plants and 2.5 ounces on you and 10 ounces at your house. And this won't begin until 2020, and stores will start opening up then as well. 30 states have also agreed on medical marijuana consumption, and 45% of Americans have said they tried or used marijuana daily. Getting into some of the marijuana benefits, sales have exploded to $7.7 billion as of 2017, which is a 33% increase from 2016 sales. Sales are expected to reach $30 billion by 2022, and a potential of $104.5 billion in federal tax revenue. This is also projected to create 1 million new jobs. Some more benefits to this are that we are taking the money out of the cartels, drug dealers, and reducing violence on the street. By legalization, there will now be more control and less crime with the government intervention on the sales and the supply side. This will also help reduce crime rates and improve unemployment rates within the states. Finally, this will now allow the government to turn their heads towards something that is more crime-related into the opiate world. So now that we've heard about the states who have legalized marijuana, now let's hear about the countries who have politically accepted marijuana as a legalized drug, starting with the Netherlands. They have marijuana coffee shops in Amsterdam as a sign of social community coming together or a place for social gatherings. Moving on to North Korea. North Korea has marijuana for sale at $6 per kilo, so many tourists come in and buy in bulk. But their lives are also at mercy due to the restriction on travel to North Korea. Moving on to Uruguay. Uruguay was a big step for the marijuana industry. They were the first ever country to allow marijuana to be in pharmacies. They currently have 16 pharmacies and are changing the world on a daily basis about how they look at medical marijuana usage. And Canada, they're simply just the most recent country to adopt it and now opening up stores for medical marijuana sales. Peru also has restrictions of 8 grams. And then moving on to Mexico. Mexico is a big area for marijuana usage and marijuana distribution. They actually created the war on drugs, which has put a scare to many of the older people and older generations about the possible pitfalls and downfalls of marijuana. And as you can see on this list, there are also many other big countries such as Australia, Switzerland, Argentina, and Italy who have also legalized marijuana as well.
So that concludes our presentation about drug legalization. We discussed some pros, cons, facts, politics, a little bit of everything around the topic. Our last two slides are our reference list, and we thank you for listening.